Well, good afternoon, guys. Thank you for joining us today. This is one of our statewide webinars. This is actually bullying involving students with disabilities. Before we get started, let's get a little bit of housekeeping and some things out of the way, and then we'll tell you who we are, and we'll get over to Colleen's presentation. So first things first, I'm Megan Sanders. I'm the Training and Evaluation Specialist for Partners Resource Network. And Ms. Christina Henning is also joining us today. She's the Director of Statewide Services. Partners Resource Network is the nonprofit agency that operates the statewide network of parent training and information centers. You probably know us in your area as either PATH Project, PIN Project, or TEAM Project. We are federally funded by a grant from Department of Education, Office of Special Education, or OSEP. And we provide parents with training and education, as well as technical assistance, and provide a variety of webinars, in-person trainings, information, referral, and emotional support for those serving, working with, and parents of children with disabilities. Right, so before we get over to Colleen, a few things. You know, we interact in the chat box. So if you guys are having any kind of IT issues, or if you have any kind of comments or anything like that, feel free to drop that in the chat box. We also have shared a few links in here and we'll continue to do so. You can get a copy of the PowerPoint right now if you're just hopping on by going to the link shared in the chat box. Also, we are doing a Q&A session at the end of this, and there's a box outside of the chat. If you go down to your menu, it says Q&A. If you don't mind plugging your questions in there for Colleen, it makes things a little bit easier. It doesn't get lost and all of the things that can happen in our chat box. So go ahead and plug those in the Q&A box, and we'll get to those at the end of the presentation. All right. So let me introduce Colleen, and then we'll get her going. So this is Colleen Elbe. She is a supervising attorney with DisabilityRights Texas in Lubbock, Texas. Colleen graduated with a bachelor's degree in psychology from the University of New Mexico and a master's degree in marriage and family therapy from Friends University. Prior to law school, she worked for a state family preservation contractor providing therapy to families at risk of losing their children to the foster care system. Colleen is a graduate of Texas Tech School of Law, where she was on the Board of Barristers member and graduated with a health law certificate. After graduation from law school, Colleen received a fellowship from Equal Justice Works to represent students with disabilities facing a legal suspension or expulsion. All right, Colleen, well, I will let you get started and then come back when we get ready for Q&A.
Great. Thank you, Megan. I appreciate it. And it's always nice to be back with everybody. Thanks for taking your lunch hour to listen to me talk. I wanted to first say that DisabilityRights Texas, we provide free legal services to our clients. But since probably none of you out there are my client, I cannot provide specific free legal advice to you today. So I encourage you to use that Q&A box that Megan was talking about for general questions, procedural questions. But if you've got any particular complaints about your district or a particular situation with your student, please contact us directly so we can see if that's a case that we would take on and be able to provide some assistance. And I always hate to do that and tell people that, but it's very important. That way I don't get bogged down giving advice to everybody on very particular situations. To do an intake with our office, we are a statewide agency based out of Austin. You can call 1-800-252-9108 Monday through Friday, 9 to 4 to do an intake, or you can go online in your pajamas 24/7, whatever's easier, and do an intake that way. So DisabilityRights Texas is the protection and advocacy system for the state of Texas. I just need to find my little advice. There we go. Oops. This is our mission. We are here to help people with disabilities understand and exercise their full rights under the law and to ensure their full and equal participation in society. And when I was thinking about how that mission fits with bullying of students with disabilities, obviously if a student is being bullied, they're not being fully included in the school environment. They're not exercising all of their rights under the law to be safe at school, and maybe not even being able to access a FAPE under federal law, which we'll talk about today. So a little bit about what we're going to talk about today. We'll do some facts and definitions about bullying, just so that we're all on the same page about what we're talking about. We'll discuss some prevention strategies on both the school side as well as some family prevention strategies as well. We're going to talk about best practice responses. So this would be after we know that an instance of bullying has occurred. What is the best way for the school district to respond? What should a parent expect? But then also what requirements or what duties does a parent have to notify the district? So we're going to talk about both of those today. And then finally, we'll also talk about what are some of the federal and state guidance, laws, and then also the remedies under each of those laws for parents that have had students bullied at school. And, you know, when we talk about federal and state, there probably is no surprise that bullying happens in Texas, just like it does in every other state in the nation. So we'll talk about some general statistics up here with the facts and definitions, but I'll point out some differences where Texas, we like to do things different sometimes. So I'll point out some differences between some of the federal information and some of the state information. And it's a real timely conversation to have. I'm sure most of you are aware that are joining today that October is Bullying Prevention and Awareness Month. So this is a really timely presentation. I had the privilege of doing this last October as well. And hopefully it's just good information and a good reminder to all of us that this does happen. It happens in our state, it happens in our communities, and it happens at our schools. Okay, so let's start with some general definitions just to be sure we're all on the same page about what we're talking about here today. Bullying is the unwanted, unintentional, and repeated aggressive behavior that includes a real or perceived power imbalance. And that's a lot of big words, but one of the words that I want to focus on is the word repeated, because that's a little bit different in Texas. In other states, state statutes say that a behavior has to be repeated, happen multiple times in order to be considered bullying. Texas law does not say that. It can happen one time and it can rise to the level of bullying under the Texas statute. So that one word is a little bit different here in Texas. Now, does that mean that parents in other states should wait until it happens multiple times before they tell anybody or before they, you know, request help from the school? Absolutely not. Of course, I always tell my parents to keep the school up to date on any issue that they think might rise to the level of bullying. And we'll talk about how to report that to the school district, some of those responsibilities that a parent has to notify the district and why that's important. There's a resource here in Texas from the Texas School Safety Center, and it's a checklist that parents can go online and answer some questions about the behavior that's happening at school or the things that their students are being subjected to see if it rises to the level of bullying. And while it's a fantastic resource, again, the Texas School Safety Center checklist, I encourage my parents to think about that if you even have to go to a website like that and answer those questions, follow your gut instincts and your parent intuition. If you think it could rise to the level of bullying and you're not sure, you should always err on the fact that it does and make sure that it's reported and that you're seeking some resources and some help to address that situation. And then the different kinds of bullying we'll talk about real quickly. So two different kinds and then some different modes. Direct and indirect are the two different kinds. So direct is I get maybe what we all assume bullying looks like, right? It's a fight. It's being shoved or picked on physically, being yelled at or called names verbally to your face. But just as harmful and just as inappropriate is indirect bullying. Indirect would be more like rumor spreading, things that are said behind the intended victim's back, things that are done not in front of them, but out of their presence. And then both of those, both indirect and direct, can be verbal, they can be physical, they can be relational. That's kind of the rumor spreading or the intent to destroy relationships of that targeted youth. And then they can also be damage to property. That can happen both indirect and direct as well. So that could be whatever's on the person of the intended victim, breaking or destroying something, but it can also be behind their back. A lot of times through cyberbullying, an indirect form of cyberbullying is damage to intellectual property. We don't really think that our kids have intellectual property, but with everything being stored in the cloud, and kids are smart enough to now hack computers, that's a possibility that there could be some damage to intellectual property of a student just with their online information. So something new and kind of something different to think about. Probably the biggest one, and we'll talk about some statistics here in a little while, but the biggest one that I see in my own child and that I hear the most about from the families that I work with is the cyberbullying. This screen in front of me kind of makes me feel a little protected. I'd probably be a little bit more nervous if I was standing in front of however many people we have on today. I feel okay behind the screen. And unfortunately, so do bullies. A lot of times they feel like their words that they put out on social media or through emails or text messages on phones, that it somehow doesn't mean as much, or it's not as bad as if they said it face to face. And that is absolutely not true. Cyberbullying is just as horrible of devastating to any student, and especially a student with a disability, than any other of the verbal, physical, or relational ones. And we'll talk more about cyberbullying as we go on today, because Texas is a little bit different, and we have some different protections for that in the last couple of legislative sessions that I want to spend some time talking about. So it's just some statistics and numbers. 1 in 5 kids are bullied at school. Nationwide statistic. I'm going to guess it's probably more than that. I think that when we talk about, or when we think about the kids that don't report bullying, that's number's probably going to be more. And interesting, I always think of bullying as teenagers. High school was rough for me, so that's where, and so was middle school now that I think about it. But actually, you might find it surprising that the most common age of children that are bullied is 6 years old. And so that's important to think about for a couple of different reasons. It's important for districts to know that statistic, because anti-bullying programming shouldn't start in middle school. It should start in pre-K and kindergarten. Those children should know the effects of bullying, know the warning signs way earlier than middle school or high school. They should have that programming very, very early on. The next most common age is 7, and then it kind of goes down as the age goes up chronologically. So that's kind of a surprising statistic to me. What's not surprising to me is that girls are not only more likely to be bullied, they're actually more likely to be the bullies. And I haven't looked at the statistics, but I wonder if that's changed with the rise of social media and cyberbullying. I have firsthand knowledge that girls can be very mean, so that's why that statistic does not surprise me. I think we view boys as being more likely to be bullies because we see it more often. Boys are more likely to be direct and physical, and that's what we see in behaviors. That's easy to see. But just like an invisible disability, just because you don't see it doesn't mean it doesn't happen. And so when we're collecting data, it doesn't surprise me that when we include all of those different modes of bullying, girls are more likely to be bullied and to be the bully rather than boys. And then an important question to keep in mind is that, you know, when we think about students of color, minority students, they are more likely to be the victims of bullying. So the answer to the question of does race and ethnicity play a part in bullying, the answer is very simply yes, it does. And that should always be a factor that we take into consideration. And I think I might have missed a slide, so let me go back and see. Yes, so I mentioned that Texas does a little something different with cyberbullying. And I apologize for skipping over this slide, but it's very important. We had a law passed that was named after David Molak. I think that's how you say his last name. He was harassed online for months. He was threatened with physical violence. His classmates were mocking his appearance, very, very hateful and harassing behaviors from his classmates. He endured that for months, and at the age of 16 years old, it finally got so bad and became so unbearable for him, he took his own life. And the Texas legislature passed a law called David's Law in his honor that really put some teeth into the Texas statutes regarding cyberbullying. And it does that in a couple of different ways. First of all, it expands the options of districts to discipline cyberbullying to off-campus. And that might seem like a pretty logical jump because, you know, kids take their phones home, they take laptops home, they have iPads and Apple computers and everything. So if a student bullies another student via any online or text message with any kind of electronic device, the school can and should, by law now, get involved and make sure that's reported and addressed, even if that behavior does not occur on campus. Also, reporting was made easier. You might see districts are posting anonymous tip lines or links on their websites, or they're coming home in your students' information at the beginning of the school year. Anonymous reporting was part of David's Law, and that's why you're seeing an increase in being able to being anonymous in those reportings. And then the other thing is that, again, you would think it'd be common sense that if a staff of a district or an administrator of a campus became aware that bullying was happening, that they would report it. Now we've just codified that, and we've made it a law that if there is a suspicion of bullying, that staff and administrators have to report that, either to their ISD police department or the city police department. And then there's a notice requirement in David's Law as well. Again, you would think this would happen regularly, but the Texas legislature thought it was enough, had enough importance that we wanted to put it into our law that schools are mandated to notify parents of the alleged victim of bullying on or before the third day after they're made aware that it's happening. And then the district is mandated to notify the parents of the alleged bully within a reasonable amount of time after the incident is reported. So a little bit different standards, but notice for both sides. Okay, so just some more information on kind of focusing specifically on students with disabilities that are bullied, because those facts and those numbers, and obviously the Texas law applies to all students, not just students with disabilities. But the reason it's so important to have this conversation about students with disabilities is because we know that they're 2 to 3 times more likely to be bullied than their non-disabled peers. And when we think about all the reasons why that data would support that conclusion, it's not surprising. Students with disabilities might look different, they might act different, they might talk different, they might not respond like their non-disabled peers in typical school scenarios. They're kind of just that target because of their differences. While we celebrate differences, typically we know that some students don't. Bullies definitely pick on differences. Another reason might be that along with that disability comes some manifestations of a lower self-esteem, or maybe not having the social skills to know what a true friendship really looks like, not to know when someone is picking on you, or not knowing, or not having the skills to self-advocate and report that, and let somebody know, hey, what so-and-so is doing or saying is not okay with me. So there's a lot of different factors that go into that. We've definitely talked about the different bullying and the different forms of bullying. Students with disabilities, we see represented in all different forms, in all different modalities. Certainly the cyberbullying is on a huge increase for students with disabilities, just like students across the board, nationwide. And then we know that bullying for any child comes with harm. But when we think of how bullying impacts a student with a disability, that harm is even greater. We're talking about changes in mood and changes in behavior that you might see, and we'll talk about the warning signs of that in a little while. But it really impacts a student with a disability that cannot communicate or ask for help like we would expect a student without a disability to do. So a lot of times what happens, some of that harm comes from, if a kiddo is being bullied at school, they might not want to go. And so you might see attendance problems that are in relation to the simple avoidance of the bully. It's a very, that cause and effect makes sense. If I was being bullied at work every day, I probably wouldn't want to come to work. So you might see truancy issues with students with disabilities. And we know that truancy causes a bunch of other behaviors. Students that aren't going to school are obviously going to suffer from academic programming issues, lower grades, higher rates of dropout, and just all of the stuff that goes along with not being in school like they should. And sometimes, even if they do go to school, they might not be able to focus. They might be, super sensitive to what's going on with the bully, that they can't do their math. That's probably very expected, and that lack of focus you could see along with the harm that's caused by bullying. We talked a little bit about the emotional toll, and we know too that when we talk about students with disabilities, we always, well, at least in the families that I work with, as we're getting into the teenage years, we always start talking about self-advocacy, because we want this child with a disability to grow into an adult that stands up for themselves and that can advocate for themselves in the community, and that practice starts at school. And so a lot of times students need to learn how to do that. That's not an innate skill for a lot of people. So it's a lot of discussions about what does a true friendship look like? What is true friendship not? Having those social skills stories, maybe conversations with parents. Here's what to do if you don't think something's right. Here's what to do if you think somebody's mistreating you. Here's a safe person you can talk to. Constantly having those conversations and reiterating that it's okay to stand up for yourself. It's okay to let an adult know what's going on and ask for help. One thing that I always kind of squeeze into this presentation at this point is one of my pet peeves about behavior intervention plans, if any of your students or kiddos have those. A very common goal on behavior intervention plans is strict compliance. And I don't like that word for this exact self-advocacy reason. I encourage districts to change the wording to comply with classroom rules. That's fine. There's always going to be rules that students need to follow. But when you start teaching a child at a young age that compliance is mandatory, and that if an adult tells you to do something, you have to do it, no questions asked, no reasons given, just compliance. My fear is that these kids are going to grow up to be young adults that don't know how to ask for help, and that have been trained that if somebody is bigger than you and in a power position over you that they can tell you to do anything and you have to comply. So that's just kind of my little pet peeve, that I think if we changed wording on behavior intervention plans, we could be a lot more proactive about that kind of stuff. And in the long term, hopefully prevent bullying in a way as well. Also, you know, as you're going through bullying, just know that there's help out there. There's resources at the district level, at the community level, certainly at the state level, and also a lot of information nationwide. With a lot of the school violence issues that have happened nationwide, there's been agencies and foundations that have been started that are promoting positive experiences at school and anti-bullying campaigns. So there's just a ton of resources out there, and you're not alone in the you know, in the crusade against bullying. Okay, so some, again, I think I might have missed one. Let me go back. So some warning signs of if your child is the victim of a bully. You might see behavior changes at home, in their sleeping habits, in their eating habits, just in their daily routine. Maybe they seem more withdrawn than usual, snappy with parents, snippy, snappy, and defensive. School behavior too, you might see as well. You also might, it's not quite behavior, but you also might want to look for physical signs of bullying. Any kind of marks, not only given to them by somebody else, by the bully, but also self-harm marks. We know that children who are bullied are more likely to internalize that and in turn self-harm. So always keep an eye out for those physical signs as well. We talked about attendance problems. Certainly change in friends. And they tell you this about any of your teenage kiddos for a couple of different reasons, substance abuse and as well as bullying. But you want to have those conversations about, you know, who they're hanging out with and who's new and who's out of the group and why, and just having those open dialogues with your kiddos about their friends. And then also keep an eye out for the changes in the mood disturbance, an increase in mood disturbances. So that would be a very persistent mood of unhappiness, or a big change in their moodiness, if they're up and downs. Just looking for any of those changes. Those are all warning signs. And again, like I said earlier, I always encourage my parents to trust your gut. If you think something's going on, talk about it, report it, let somebody know, and don't deal with it alone. But certainly don't ignore your gut instinct about your kid. Okay, so some prevention strategies. Some might seem, to all of you out there, they might seem very in second nature, but for a lot of people in the community, they're not. And so a responsibility falls on all of us to almost do some education for people. The first and most important thing is people first language. If you start seeing a person with a disability as a person with a disability, instead of that person just being the disability, it's a huge difference in how that person is included into society, and that includes on our campuses. So always referring to a student with a disability rather than a disabled student. If somebody messes up and doesn't know the importance of people first language, I feel like I have a duty to politely correct them and explain why it's important. I think that's a great first step in preventing bullying of students with disabilities. The other thing is an inclusive setting. We talk about LRE all the time in our ARD meetings. But really, inclusion, when we're talking about bullying and kids with disabilities feeling a part of the community, it's more than just LRE on a checkbox. It's more than just a PEIMS code of where that kid sits during the day. It's that child feeling a part of that campus, feeling connected to people at their school, with the adults, knowing that a staff member cares about them, knowing that they have somebody to talk to if something goes wrong. Making students with disabilities feel included in that community is so important to preventing bullying on campuses. And then, of course, anti-bullying curriculum and training programs, not only for students, but also for staff. There's a lot of great different curriculums out there that really promote that inclusion feeling and the positive interactions that can happen in a day, focusing on that. Tons of resources out there, and I would encourage you to know what your district uses and talk to your kid about the assemblies that they go to or any kind of anti-bullying training that they're getting during their day. Strong policies and procedures. You know, making sure that a district is communicating that it's not okay. Bullying is not accepted. It's not okay. They'll take every report seriously. They'll investigate it, which we'll talk about in a second. But just having those strong policies and procedures in place in writing to make sure that that's being enforced across the district consistently. Mentoring programs have been shown to work wonders, especially with students with disabilities. Kind of just facilitating that peer-to-peer connection again, making the student feel included and welcomed and like they have a connection with somebody. That's a really basic building block of building a sense of community on a campus. And statistics show that those mentoring programs, they're positive for both the student with the disability and the general education student. They both get something out of it. It's kind of like a win-win situation. So those are very important. And there's a bunch of curriculums on how to implement that at the campus level available as well. So that's definitely out there. Another important thing is to reward and model appropriate behaviors. Again, not only for peers, but also for staff. It's important for kids to see staff members that are included, that are diverse, that are feel connected to the campus. They get excited about things. When you role model that positivity and that sense of inclusion, that's a great prevention strategy to prevent bullying. And then also notify and include parents. You know, for the most part, parents want to be a part of their kids' community. They want to know what's going on in a day. They want to know, you know, what's being presented to their student, how their student's doing. So really having an open dialogue or an open door to parents at a campus is important. Active parents are much more likely to know if their child is being bullied rather than a non-active parent. Okay, so let's now kind of move into you suspect that there has been an instance of bullying and that your child's been a victim of. What now? Where do you start? What do you do now? So we'll start with the parent responses. The most important thing a parent can do when they suspect bullying is to notify the campus in writing of their suspicions. You have to, can I say it again, have to put the district on notice that there's a problem. Be as specific as you can. Time, place, student's name, what exactly was said, done, be as specific as possible. And in that formal grievance that you're going to file, we'll talk about that in a second, also include what you want to see happen, an investigation, but also remedies, what you feel as the parent needs to happen to keep your child safe. Give the campus some ideas. If it's a particular situation at a particular time of day and you think that just added supervision would prevent this from happening again, request that in writing. The worst that a campus can do is say no, and then you have that discussion as to why not, or what else can we do. But put what you would like to see as a parent to address the situation in writing so that the district has some idea as to what you want to see happen to keep your kiddo safe. So when you do this, you're going to file a formal grievance at the district level. I would like to think that all districts look pretty much the same across Texas in their policies and procedures for formal grievances, but that's sometimes not the case. Sometimes you can find a form for that on your district's website. Sometimes you can't. So what I always encourage my parents to do is to contact the superintendent's office and request, if there is one, request a form to fill out for a parent grievance. And again, in that grievance, you're going to request an investigation. And then most districts, I put follow up with multiple level appeals. That might not always be necessary, but just know that districts across the state typically have a 3-tiered appeals level. So if you make a formal grievance to the campus level, let's say, and your request for an investigation into something is denied, then you have the right to appeal that grievance to the next level. And those levels of appeals and those policies can always be found online. But again, if you're struggling finding them online, call and ask for a copy. You should be provided a copy by your superintendent's office, or your special education department even might help you access that. And so that you know what the procedures are for following up, because following up sometimes does become important. Probably the most frustrating part about an investigation into bullying is that the parents of the victim want to know everything. They want to know who did it, when they did it, why they did it, what's the school going to do to them, what punishment does that kid get for what they did to my kid. And you can't know everything. And I always explain, it's not the district being shady. It's not the district necessarily hiding anything from you. It's that there's a federal law that protects your child too, but it also protects the alleged bully. The district cannot release information on disciplinary measures taken against another student, even if it's the alleged bully of your student. So the district might agree to investigate, and you might find out, yep, we investigated, but you might never know what happened to the bully. I work in a lot of small districts in rural West Texas, so pretty much everybody knows what happened to the alleged bully, whether or not the school tells, because people talk in small communities. So sometimes parents find out, but if they don't, that's a really frustrating thing, is to just not know that somebody was held accountable for what they did to your kid. And I just don't want to get anybody's hopes up that you're going to have all the answers, even if the school does a fantastic investigation and does hold somebody accountable for that. You just might never know. And that's always frustrating for parents. One of the other parent responses, Texas law was passed that said a parent of a victim of bullying can request a transfer to a different campus to get away from that bully. That becomes a little sticky. Again, I'm kind of used to some of the smaller districts where, let's say, there's only one middle school. Where's this kid going to transfer to? So we need to get a little bit more creative about scheduling and programming to try to keep those kids away from each other. But if your district has multiple campuses for that same grade level, you have the right to request a transfer to a different campus under Texas law. Certainly, if you think it rises to the level of police involvement, you need to be reporting that to either your campus police department or your local community department, whether that's city or county sheriff. When in doubt, do both. If one's not appropriate, they'll tell you to go to the other and vice versa. So just be sure your bases are covered if you feel like it rises to the level of a criminal action. All right, and then school responsibilities. We talked about notifying parents that there needs to be notification now under Texas law to both the parents of the victim and parents of the alleged bully. The school's inquiry into a written report of bullying, it should be immediate and it should be appropriate. So we want to be sure that if it's reported on a Monday, we're not waiting until Friday to start an investigation. And we want to be sure that appropriate actions are taken. That means were people interviewed? Is there security footage that was pulled to review to see if it happened? All of those things can lead to an appropriate investigation. The other word that I don't have on here is that it should be impartial. Again, speaking to you from somebody who's in smaller districts, a lot of times, I had a bullying case where the alleged bully was the son of the assistant principal. Well, obviously, we don't want the assistant, sorry, I have something in my eye, it's driving me crazy. We don't want the assistant principal doing that investigation of his own kid. That's not impartial. So just be sure that who's looking into it is not involved in that investigation in some other weird way. We want to be sure that the school's doing interviews with the alleged victim, the alleged bully, any witnesses, any people that can give any kind of information into what really happened, why it happened, when, where, how, all of those investigation questions. Check-ins are really important because once you trigger an investigation, we want to be sure that the schools are checking in with the alleged victims and the alleged bully to be sure that this doesn't happen again, pending the investigation or pending any kind of disciplinary measure or pending any kind of safety plan to keep those kids apart. So checking in that everybody knows that retaliation is not an option, meaning that if anybody retaliates against anybody for giving information, telling, providing a statement, that that's going to be handled as a whole other separate instance of bullying, or maybe even worse than that, depending on if it becomes a criminal investigation or not. And notify everybody of what options there are, if there's counseling available, if there's some social skills training. Let parents know that you're willing to sit down and create a safety plan so that whatever the alleged victim needs to feel and be, those are two different things, feel and be safe at school, are put in place, and they're put in a written plan and followed very consistently throughout the day. Maybe increased supervision is what's needed. I think we talked about that earlier. And then districts should be looking at how this happened. Is there a gap in their policies and procedures? Do they need to beef up their anti-bullying curriculum to staff to recognize when bullying happens, or to their students to prevent bullying from even happening in the first place? So they should look outside of just that specific instance. So interestingly enough, this can drive me crazy, y'all. This last legislative session was really focused on, a lot of the focus on schools had to do with mental health in schools, just in response to all of the school violence that we've seen in our state and nationwide. So that came with a lot of discussions about how we address mental health at the school level or at the schoolhouse. We have, at DisabilityRights Texas, we have a fantastic policy team in our Austin office that does a lot of education to our legislatures about how particular bills will impact students with disabilities. So our team was on it this session, and there is some new legislation that came out of this last session, which mandates that the staff development training that, students go back a day later at the beginning of the year because of that staff development training, that now has to include information on the effects of grief and trauma on behavior like bullying. There's other things that it applies to, but bullying is a part of that now. So it's really finding that connection to how do we recognize past grief and trauma in a student and prevent that from turning into a bullying situation. So I think that that's fantastic that our legislature identified that issue and mandated that for our schools to provide to all staff. Obviously, we talked a little bit about policies and procedures about retaliation, making sure that nobody's being held responsible for saying or doing the right thing or providing information. And then I put in here, I always struggle with whether or not to include this, but if an investigation's completed and they find out that the victim of bullying tried to fight back, this would be in a very limited situation, like a physical scenario. If that self-defense was reasonable, the student will not be disciplined for that. Now, that reasonable is a really fantastic word that lawyers love because nobody knows what it means. So just know that that's out there, but it's a really sticky situation to get involved in to argue that. And the other thing that schools now, I forgot to mention this, with the last legislative session as well, schools are now required to teach what they're calling digital citizenship classes, basically teaching students how to be productive members of society in the digital world. And that includes teaching students about the legal implications of cyberbullying and what cyberbullying is. So again, that's some more information that our legislature thought was important to get to our kids, and we're super excited that that's codified now in our law. And then school districts in Texas, they must make available counseling for victims if that's appropriate. Witnesses sometimes need counseling. And then certainly the aggressor, whatever services and supports the aggressor needs, even if they're not in special education, those services must be made available if that's part of the remedy to the situation of the bullying that's occurred. Okay, so let's talk specific remedies for students with disabilities. If your student is on a 504 plan, you can file an OCR complaint, Office of Civil Rights, and we'll talk about how to do that in a second. The interesting thing about OCR, or discrimination or bullying under 504, is that it doesn't have to be about the student's disability. It could be that the student is tall for their age, has red hair and freckles. Do you see where I'm going with this? I was always really tall. If your child's on a 504 plan and they're being bullied for anything, for any reason, you can report that to OCR, to the Office of Civil Rights. OCR is going to look for intimidation or abusive behavior toward a student based on a disability that creates a hostile environment. And they're going to look to see if the district knew about it or should have known about it, which is super, super important, why we talked about filing the local level grievance in writing, putting the district on notice. Because what you can do is you can attach that letter that you sent to the district with your OCR complaint to prove that you put the district on notice about what was going on. And then OCR will look to see if what the school's actions were, if they were appropriate or not. If your child is 504 and you want information on how to file an OCR complaint, you can go to our website, drtx.org, and we have an IDEA parent manual, and there's information in there about how to file an OCR complaint. You can also go directly to the Office of Civil Rights website, and they've got a link for a PDF document that you can fill out and submit electronically for that as well. So under IDEA and 504 both, bullying can rise to the level of a denial of faith. So that basically means that because of the bullying, your student is no longer receiving a meaningful educational benefit. That might be proven with absences or with failing grades. The bullying gets so bad that your child is no longer able to access their free, appropriate public education. I always encourage my families that I work with, if your child is being served under IDEA and the bullying is severe, call an ARD meeting, because there might be services and supports that the ARD committee can recommend that would address that the harm caused by the bullying, but they can also recommend a change in services or a change in schedule to address it. And it's another great way to get in writing that the district was on notice of the bullying and how severe it had become. It was so bad that a parent felt like they needed to call an ARD committee meeting to discuss how it's impacting their child's access to faith. If your child is served under IDEA and is a victim of bullying, we always want to keep in mind the least restrictive environment. Sometimes the knee-jerk reaction is to punish the victim, meaning they move the victim to a more restrictive setting, thinking that that's what keeps them safe and that's what keeps them away from the bully. The problem with that is that federal law, as you know, says that that student with a disability is always entitled to their individual least restrictive environment. And there's no but or if or unless they're being bullied. So make sure that any recommendation in a change in their schedule or a change in their placement isn't putting them in a more restrictive environment than necessary. You can definitely get some additional supports and services without making a placement more restrictive. And then also consider if there's a need for updated evaluations or for new evaluations. Sometimes bullying can be so harmful that there's anxiety issues that may not have never been there before that's impacting a child's learning. There could be PTSD issues, just lots of new stuff to worry about with bullying that the school might have a child find obligation to either reevaluate or do some new evaluations about. Again, the remedies for parents, if you feel like the bullying has risen to the level where your child cannot access a FAPE, then if your child served under IDEA, you have the right to file a TEA complaint. And you also have the right to file a request for due process. I certainly would encourage families to include any written notice that they've already provided the district and any written responses that families don't feel are adequate from the district in those complaints, just to put the investigators on notice of what's already been done and what's already been tried. Some of the remedies that TEA sometimes awards, whether that's a hearing officer or an investigator, might be a little bit different, but certainly for that particular victim, there might be additional supports or services that had previously been denied. There's always the option for compensatory education services. If the district knew that a child was being bullied and didn't do anything to stop it from reoccurring, and it did, and it led to the denial of FAPE, then that's something that TEA or a hearing officer might find the district liable for, to go back and kind of make up some of that time that was missed because of that denial of FAPE. And then always on my TEA complaints, I suggest that parents request some systemic relief as well. If your child is bullied to the point where you feel like it's necessary to make a state complaint, my guess is that your child's not the only one being bullied, either at that campus or at that district. So maybe it's appropriate to request that the district take a look at their policies and procedures, take a look at their prevention strategies, the curriculum that they're using, to see if there's any gaps in those, or to see if there's any additional training that staff needs or that students need in order to prevent further bullying. Also, you can certainly request the transfer if that was previously denied, like we talked about earlier. If you made that request in writing and it was denied, you can bring that up in a TEA complaint. And then, of course, private school tuition is reimbursement is a very, very difficult remedy for parents to get. But by law, that's certainly one of your rights to request. Just know in the state of Texas, those are very, very they're not likely to be successful. But that's certainly a remedy to request in a complaint that's within reason. And then I put some resources that are mainly federal. The stopbullying.gov website has a ton of statistics and facts and just data. A good idea of what other states consider bullying, not just Texas. Pacer.org/bullying is another nationwide kind of clearinghouse of good information and different resources, both data and curriculum focused as well. SafeSupportiveSchools.ed.gov is another one. Sandy Hook Promise and Rachel's Challenge are both anti-bullying curriculums that, I don't know if I'm using the right word, programming maybe is a better word, that came out of school shootings. So Sandy Hook, obviously from Sandy Hook, and Rachel, I cannot recall her last name right now, she was a victim at Columbine. And so those two websites provide a lot of really positive strategies to make all students feel included and part of the community, and to eventually decrease the amount of bullying, and some really good prevention strategies there. And then obviously one of your resources, again, if you have any individual or situational questions, concerns, or you feel like you need DRTX's assistance, there's our website, and that is our statewide intake number. Again, Monday through Friday, 9 to 4. If there's no answer, please, please, please leave a voicemail, because we will get back with you as quickly as we can to see if there's anything we can do to help. And we're really good about, even if we can't take your case, if it doesn't fit with our priorities, or if we just don't have the staff resources to take your particular case, we're not just going to turn you away with nothing. We always try to give information to our families, give them a resource or a path to try. We just don't want to send you away empty-handed. So it never hurts to call and do an intake, even if we can't assist you in the long run. Hopefully you'll get some good information and some good ideas of what to do next. So that's really all I had today. I left some time for questions if we have a couple minutes, and I think Megan was going to sort through the Q&A box for me and hit me hard.
So I know that I think I'm seeing some questions that came up on the chat box. If you did put your questions in the chat box, please, please, please move them over to Q&A so we don't miss them, because I'm not seeing them and they may have been covered up. So let me know there. But we do have a couple of questions in the actual Q&A box, so okay, we will get those. Does student bullying record follow a student to a new school? Such as if something happens in elementary and is a part of the record, does the middle school administration have access to that information?
So here we go. It depends. And I know everybody hates that answer. I'm sorry, but it really does. It depends on your district's policy. If that student, the alleged bully, was disciplined, that discipline record, yes, could follow them to a different campus within that same district if that's their standard practice. If their standard practice is to destroy discipline records at the end of the school year, then the answer would be no. And then certainly if there's no discipline that was taken against the alleged bully, then there's probably no record of it that would follow them. So I'm sorry, but it depends.
All right. Do you have any suggestions for how a student can disarm a bullying situation? Escalating a situation by bringing in administrators seems likely to make the situation worse.
That's unfortunate. I hate to hear that, because I would hope that staff members, when brought into a situation, are defusing that situation. But interestingly enough, there's good data that shows that sometimes all a bullying situation takes is one student stepping in and kind of calling it quits, saying this is not okay, stop it, and putting a stop to that behavior. I don't know how far I would encourage that to go, especially if it's a physical altercation, but don't ever underestimate the power of peers, because peers have great influence on a bullying situation. But I would just always hope there's some adult at a campus that a kiddo feels safe going to report that and to get help from.
All right, we did have a follow-up question come through for the student record. What if the student record is for the student actually being bullied?
Oh, okay. So it probably, well, again, I think it depends. If you brought up that situation in an ARD committee meeting and it's in the minutes, it's documented in deliberations, then technically that could follow them to a different campus. But as far as an entry in any kind of hard file, I don't know if that investigative report or questioning would be a part of the alleged victim's file. I think if a parent wanted it to be, then they kind of had to have a duty to notify the new campus that this is what happened before, and to provide that information to the receiving campus to be aware if that's still a concern or an issue. But I don't know if there'd be anything in the victim's hard file that would follow them necessarily.
Okay. Have there been situations where students with disabilities were accused of bullying? And this is specific to these kids may not have a filter in what they say. They could be aggressive. Is this a concern?
Sure. And so I think that Yes, of course, there's a possibility of that. Always my interest, if one of my students is alleged to be an actual bully doing the bullying, are we looking at a manifestation of a disability, or are we looking at true bullying? And usually it's not that use of power to be aggressive against somebody else. It's typically a manifestation of a disability that has been misinterpreted as bullying. But it's possible that a student with a disability could be a bully, of course.
All right. What happens if both students have disabilities and are both served in a self-contained classroom, but the school refuses to move the bullied student or the bully?
That's a difficult one. And that puts us in a weird spot because we typically don't like to get involved when it's a person with a disability versus a person with a disability. It becomes a resource issue for that campus. Again, if within that district there's another self-contained classroom on a different campus, that might be an option. And if that is an option and they're denying that transfer and the victim wants that transfer, then that could be subject for a TEA complaint, because that's certainly a parent's right under the law. It gets a little trickier if there are no other placement options and there are no other places to go for that victim or for that alleged bully. There's a particular part of the penal code that if there's some sexual aggressiveness and some sexual crimes that occurred, there's some additional protections. But if we're talking about just regular, I hate to use that word, regular bullying that doesn't include any sex offenses, that becomes difficult for parents and for smaller districts as well. It's just a discussion about how then to keep them as separate as possible and as safe as possible.
All right, what were the classes called? You said digital something.
Digital citizenship. So just like teaching our kids how to be good citizens in the world, how to access their right to vote, how to be productive members of society, schools now have to teach the same thing, but in the digital world, what it means to be a good steward of electronic use. And that's probably a lot of things that adults could benefit from as well. But now schools have to be teaching our kiddos that. So it's a good first step. Good first step.
Good. All right. Does David's law apply only to cyberbullying? And we're talking as far as requirements and repercussions.
Yes, David's law is only focused on cyberbullying.
All right. Can you please go over the special education camera law?
Ooh, I don't know if we've got time. So yes, quickly, if your student is in a classroom where over 50% of the students are served by special education services more than 50% of the day, that classroom could qualify for cameras. It has to be made by parent request in writing. Every district is different about how you request it. So again, ask for the right form. There's a lot of gaps still in the law. It's a relatively new law. It's a good start, but we're finding some holes in how to access those videos if a parent wants to see the videos. It is not as, you can't just say, hey, I want to see my kid's class for the last 2 weeks. I think something might have happened. You have to report a particular incident with as much specificity as possible. Administrators will pull that tape. They will view it first. There's a lot of hurdles, a lot of gaps that we found, but that's at least how you get the cameras in there. Make the written request, and the district will decide if that classroom qualifies or not. Most self-contained classrooms will.
All right. Let's see. If bullying involves asking for another campus placement, is the school required to provide transportation? Specifically, what if the only other campus is a neighborhood district or neighbor district, and they get transportation from home campus?
So if it's a different district, if it's within a district, then yes, transportation should be provided. If that student was getting related services, especially as transportation before, then that should transfer. If they weren't getting related services in the form of transportation, that might be a little bit more difficult, but I'm sure that most districts would provide that transportation if it was to a campus within their district. It will likely get a little trickier if it's a campus in a different district, because then we're getting into who's responsible for what and who provides what. And it could be, because if the child's not enrolled in that district but is enrolled in the new district but the old district's providing the transfer, you see it can kind of get a little tricky. So that's definitely something to consider when requesting a transfer if there's no other options in the district.
Okay, are there resources available for other languages or communities to assist with specific populations, such as Asian or Middle Eastern families?
Well, I wish there was more, because like we talked about earlier, we know that race and ethnicity does play a factor in bullying. Certainly in some of your more higher, your larger metropolitan areas, you're going to have more resources, Dallas, Houston, Austin. Probably in some of your more rural areas, there's going to be limited resources. We try to make our, and so do other agencies statewide, our documents and handouts available in multiple languages, but I can't speak from knowledge about who might specifically have those particular languages available. I'm sorry, I don't have a good answer to that one. You stumped me.
All right. Do you have a reference to the statistics that show most common age of bullying is age 6? I'm asking because my child is 6 and I can see the signs of bullying already. However, teachers are saying they are still very young, not to take any of this as serious due to their age.
I believe that statistic came from stopbullying.gov. Either that or PACER. One of those two resources on the slide.
All right. How do you get the school to believe the bullying report if the bullying victim has a communication impairment? And they seem to assume a lack of verbal ability means nothing happened.
Sure. You cannot not communicate. So even kids who aren't verbal still communicate. And unfortunately, I think that burden lies on the parent to interpret that communication to the district, to let them know the change in the behavior, the change in the anxiety symptoms of going to a particular situation or a particular class or even to school at all. If a child is being bullied, typically they're going to communicate somehow. And it's really, unfortunately, the parent's responsibility, because you know them best, to interpret those changes in those behaviors, or the fear or the increased symptoms that are showing themselves, and kind of communicate that to the district on behalf of your child. That's a tough one.
Okay, so I see a few questions and they all kind of tie into this. It looks like, yeah, we have a few of them. What do you do if it's an educator or a staff member that is doing the bullying for your child?
So still, the absolute first thing you do is put the district on notice in writing, just like you would if it was a peer. You do have some additional options if it is a staff member or a district employee that is doing the bullying. You can, if that person is certified by the state of Texas and it's pretty egregious behavior, you can certainly make a complaint on their certification. That certification board does not investigate a lot. The things that they do tend to pick up to investigate, again, are pretty egregious behaviors on behalf of a staff member towards a child. So that's a resource that's out there. There's more information on the State Board of Educator Certification Complaint website. So SBEC, I think I'm getting that right, complaint website through TEA. They have examples of what they'll investigate and what kind of form the complaint needs to be in. But if it's something that you think, I always encourage my parents, you've got to have a relationship with this district for however many more years your kid is in school. Let somebody know what's going on. Let them know how you want it to be investigated and what remedies you want, just like you would for if it was another student doing the bullying. File that grievance and let the district respond to that notice. You've got to give them a chance to intervene and to do something.
All right. So we do have some questions we didn't get to today, but it is time to wrap up. And we do have to let Colleen go at some point. She's a very busy lady. If your questions didn't get answered and you want to send those over to me, we can get you some information, and I'm sure Colleen will at least get us resources or something like that that we can direct you to from there. Thank you so much, Colleen.
Oh, you bet. Thank you.
All right, so we're deciding to do something a little different this time around, and we want to take you over to our website. And this is the website that we share in our chat box quite frequently so that you guys know where to find the recordings of the statewide webinars and what is coming up. So we're on prntexas.org. So went down to statewide webinars. So you will see today's webinar was listed at the top, and that's where you registered. So let's go ahead and go down and talk about what we have coming up. And we have a lot of really good things coming, so I think you guys will be excited. Next Tuesday, October 15th, again at 12:15, we're going to bring in Richard Capadagli, who's spoken for us a few different times. He's going to come on and he's going to introduce strategies for helping kids cope with bullying. So make sure and join us for that. I'm sure he can answer some of the questions that are coming up in this presentation as well. And we also have that Wednesday, the 16th, Least Restrictive Environment. This is one of our webinars in collaboration with the Region 10 ESC. And we're going to have our guest presenter, Kia Saleh. He is an LSSP. So he'll be here talking about least restrictive environment. Then we're going to do October 22nd. That is the following Tuesday, turning conflict into positive outcomes. This is our webinar done by Cadre, which is the Center for Appropriate Dispute Resolution in Special Education. So they are actually joining us. This is going to be a great webinar. We encourage everybody to jump on that one. And then October 29th, we're actually going to have a Spanish presentation and webinar over bullying and strategies that you can use for helping your child cope with bullying. So kind of the same information you're getting next week, only in Spanish on the 29th of October. All right, so that wraps up this month. Then we get started in November. November 5th, we have the emotional side for parents who have children with learning disabilities. And that is a webinar series we're kind of starting up with West Texas A&M. They are going to come on and do a couple of different ones. So this will kick us off as the first one. And that's going to be done by Dr. Bell, and again with West Texas A&M. The screen froze, I think.
Okay, you want me to take over? So on November 7th, we'll have Texas Legal Framework. We'll have Region 18 joining us to kind of go over the website. That is where all the laws pertaining to special education in Texas are housed. And so there's really good information there. And they're going to give us a tour of how parents can access that information. So we're very excited about that because it can be a difficult site to maneuver at times. And we're going to have transition services and the IEP on Tuesday, November the 12th with David Banke. I killed the name. So we're very excited about that. We'll have Child Find, what is it and how does it work, in collaboration with Region 10 ESC on Wednesday, November the 13th. And we have Helpful Hints for Military Families with EFMs. That's going to be on November the 19th. And we're going to have Carrie Pico. She's the Military Outreach Specialist for PTSI, is how you say that. And that's the Virginia PTI. So we're very excited to have her join us. And then December the 3rd, we have Dyscalculia. It's a mathematics learning disability, and we'll have Dr. Shin coming to talk about causes, characteristics, and interventions. Okay. Can you see the screen yet, Megan?
All right. Yes, we're good.
Okay.
I just didn't want to interrupt you while you were going. So,
Got it.
other things to look for on our website, and this one gets asked fairly regularly, is where you can find the recordings of today's webinar and webinars that have happened that maybe you missed or would like to go back and watch again. You can find those on our recordings and resources for past webinars. 2019, obviously, we had a pretty good handful of webinars, so you'll be able to access the PowerPoint as well as the recording for any of the webinars that you may have missed and would like to see. So those are all on our website. And I think it's pretty cool that we got to go through that today and show those. Hey guys, so here is our contact information. If you have questions, if you need certificates, if you have ideas for webinars that we can do or topics or anything like that, shoot them our way. We love to hear from you guys. You can email me or Christina. Our email addresses are on the screen. You can also, of course, check out our Facebook page. We put some Facebook Lives up, some really great information, and we'll also share the recordings from our webinars on that as well. And then, of course, go to our statewide webinar page that we were just at to register for our future webinars. All right, guys, thank you so much for joining us today. We hope you learned a lot. Again, thank you, Colleen. Great information. We always love having you come. So.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate it.
Great.
Thank you, Colleen. Hope
Thanks,
you all have a good day. Bye.
Bye, guys. Thank you.